Welcome back, everybody, to the Penn Anthropology Colloquium on Sense. It's our distinct pleasure to host Professors Erin Manning and Brian Massumi for our first event of the 2022 Colloquium season. And we in Penn Anthropology would like to thank the Graduate Group in Comparative Literature and Literary Theory, the Department of English, the Center for Experimental Ethnography, and the Wolf Humanities Center for their support of today's event. I'd like to introduce my co-chair, Lauren Risvet, and we'd like to begin by saying a little bit about the goals of this colloquium series and what it's all about. The senses are a conundrum.
Sensation is a process that is both biological and cultural, one that often evades analysis, while at the same time furnishing us with our objects of study. What then might an anthropology of and beyond the sensorium look like?
The 2022 Penn Anthropology Colloquium proposes to study or consider sense as a boundary object within our four-field discipline, one that's been differentially reckoned with and reified by archaeological, biological, cultural, and linguistic anthropologists alike. Despite the different identities accrued by this object across anthropology, sense also invites conversations across these boundaries.
Diverse anthropologists invoke a number of mediating keywords that relate to the study of sensuous or sensorial phenomena: affect and experience, body and mind, ecologies and environments, kinesthesia and multimodality, materiality and mediation, information and infrastructure, among many others. Sense thus serves as a productive point of departure for examining wider comparative issues beyond an explicit focus on the sensorium per se.
Accordingly, the 2022 Penn Anthropology Colloquium investigates sense in its widest possible sense. We're particularly interested in developing lines of inquiry that attend to and interrogate the following questions.
How and to what end, how can we understand sensation and perception as processes that are at once biological, experiential, and social?
How and to what end are sensory continua or gradients segmented into discrete dimensions of socio-semiotic life? What do such segmentations reveal about the relations between sensorial and discursive semiosis?
How can we engage critically with sense modalities beyond sight and hearing in fieldwork, analysis, and interpretation? How has our near total reliance on vision and sound shaped anthropology?
From its origins in the Boasian critique of psychophysics in the late 19th century to more recent decolonizing and decolonial interventions, American anthropology has long grappled with questions of sense and sensation. How might certain genealogies of sense and sensation illuminate new histories of anthropology as a discipline?
We invite you to probe these questions with us.
And today we'll be exploring or probing these and other questions with Erin Manning and Brian Massumi. And it's a pleasure and privilege to introduce Erin Manning, who is University Research Chair in Relational Art and Philosophy in the Faculty of Fine Arts at Concordia University and founding director of Sense Lab, a laboratory that explores the intersections between art practice and philosophy through the matrix of the sensing body and movement. Erin Manning studies in the interstices of philosophy, aesthetics, and politics, concerned always about alter pedagogical and alter economic practices. 3E is the direction her current research takes, an exploration of the transversality of the three ecologies: the social, the environmental, and the conceptual. An iteration of 3E is a land-based project north of Montreal where living and learning is explored. Legacies of Sense Lab infuse the project, particularly the question of how collectivity is crafted in a more than human encounter with worlds in the making. An artist philosopher, Dr. Manning's art exhibitions include the Sydney and Moscow Biennales, Glass House, New York, Vancouver Art Museum, McCord Museum, Montreal, House of World Cultures, Berlin, and Galateca Gallery in Bucharest. Dr. Manning's books include Ephemeral Territories, 2003, Politics of Touch, 2007, Relationscapes, 2009, Always More Than One, 2013, and with Brian Massumi, Thought in the Act, 2014, The Minor Gesture, 2016, and her latest book, For the Pragmatics of the Useless, 2021.
Brian Massumi is the author of numerous works across philosophy, political theory, and art theory. His publications include Couplets, Travels in Speculative Pragmatism, 2021, 99 Theses for the Revaluation of Value, 2018, and Parables for the Virtual, Movement, Affect, Sensation, which the augmented second edition was just published last year in 2021. With Erin Manning and Three Ecologies project, he participates in the collective exploration of new ways of bringing philosophical and artistic practices into collaborative interaction. Like probably many of the people in the audience, I was first introduced to Brian Massumi when I was a sophomore in college twice, in a graduate seminar in post-war German literature at Yale, where we read Thomas Bernhard through the lens of his essay on the autonomy of affect. And when I first tried to understand Deleuze. So I still feel very indebted to him for helping me make sense of some of this material. And without further ado, we
thank you
just
very much
posted in the chat, please.
Okay, thank you very much for this very kind introduction. The questions that you raised are really crucial and really cover a range of territory that both of our work has also been engaged with, not from a particularly anthropological bias, although not excluding it, but coming from cultural and political theory and the endeavors of the past 4 decades at least to rethink the body in relation to mechanisms of power and bring those mechanisms of power back down to the level of the body, but at the same time to understand the body in such a way that at that very same level, as it's meeting those mechanisms of power, there are processes underway that have counteracting potentials toward resistance, deviation, creativity, inventiveness. So that's been, I think, a very long collective project from many different points of view. For most of them, there's one perspective that everyone writes against, which is the Cartesian perspective. We're no exception. And what we find inadequate in the way that usually plays out is that it assumes a passive receptive position as the default position of the body, with the body in the first instance as a passive receiver of impressions, with those impressions being discrete and unrelated, arriving in a kind of unrelated mass that then has to be brought into association or synthesized by the subject, so that all relation, value, import, meaningful activity falls on the side of the subject, and the physical side falls out into mute matter, where the body's physiology meets matter. So that also redistributes or distributes the abstract on one side of the subject with a lot of suspicion toward it, because if the subject is drawing things out from the mass of impressions, it could be doing that in a delusional or illusory way. And then it puts the concrete on the other side, and that ends up back in the sort of that gap sundering the mental from the physical that so many people have tried for so long to heal. But it's an extremely strong and a tenacious paradigm that tends to slip back in to accounts of perception. And there have been a lot of responses to this. One of them is, one of the strongest is phenomenology. But that's also a direction that we, neither of us, took for our own right, because it starts by positing a primary field of consciousness as the foundation of perception, which makes mechanisms of reflexivity or reflectivity fundamental. So we both tended, we meandered toward process philosophy through Deleuze-Guattari, through a lot of other thinkers. Derrida was very important for Erin, because rather than positing the foundation of perception as a field of reflectivity and consciousness, process philosophy simply posits the world as the field of emergence of perception and construes consciousness as a limited, emergent province, region within that world, and reflectivity as a very special function. So what it starts from is not reflectivity, but activity, movement. And it finds that in movement, there are already forms of abstraction or forms of thought that are directly perceptual, already feeling, already felt, prior to the subject of consciousness. So that's the region that our work tries to delve into, and it involves really trying to reconfigure in a serious way the relationship between the concrete and the abstract and the thought and feeling, and create concepts for bringing them operatively together. And then from that, repositioning or reposing questions of power and of a political and ethical nature. So we thought we would, instead of giving a formal talk today, we thought we would start from just a selection of quotes from both of our works that touch on a number of the concepts that have woven through both of our works and woven back and forth between them. And then simply talk to those quotations and see what we can generate on the fly.
So hopefully you can all find in the chat a document called Penn Misplaced Concreteness. If you came into the chat too late, we can repost it. A couple of signposts as we get going. The question of the senses and the way that we'll be talking about it today is a lived question for us. Brian and I don't make a separation between how we live and how we write, or how we write and what is important to us. And so when we go through these 20 years of writings, we're finding ourselves living the question in different ways. I hadn't returned to Politics of Touch for a long time. Politics of Touch was my first book after my PhD, and I found that almost every citation I had around the senses was Brian's work. I wrote most of Politics of Touch before I met Brian. And I remember thinking, when I read Parables for the Virtual, I remember having that feeling that somebody else had already sort of found their way into these questions, and would I be up for the challenge of encountering that modality of thinking. And lucky for me, I not only encountered the modality of thinking, but the person too. And so part of what we'll be doing today is also encountering each other's vocabulary around these questions in different phases that we might not return to in quite the same way today. And we decided to keep that there as we meander our way through them. And so what the idea is not for us to go linearly through the citations, we'd never get through them, but rather to give you a bit of a sense of a map of where certain concepts have played out in our work, in an attempt to take us perhaps into a surprising place, or at least a surprising place for us, where we're in conversation around the concepts. And so I thought we could begin with the title of the introduction to Parables for the Virtual, which I know gave me so much to think about, and it was hard to understand when I read it the first time, which is concrete is as concrete doesn't. And so concrete is as concrete doesn't is so much of what Brian entered with, but let's start there and return to this complex of where the concrete and the abstract coincide in a process philosophical way of thinking.
Did you want to say something?
No, I want you to start.
Okay. Yeah, well, first of all, going back to what Erin said about having to live the concepts, there's a quote that I love from Deleuze that says that concepts must be lived and they can only be lived. And that sounds like sort of a rallying cry toward the concrete, but he also says that all we are, or all we experience, is the abstract. So there's a problematization of that relationship in his work that leads in very interesting directions. And concrete is as concrete doesn't isn't meant just to be an aporia or a paradox. It's meant to be a productive paradox. And what it hopes to do is to put the concrete and the abstract into a process together as phases of each other, where there's a certain kind of pulsing or alternation. So the concrete is when a form that we could take to be enduring or static creates an emphasis in the flow of experience and stands out, and a word can be attached to it. Meanings that pin it down can be attached to the word. So it emerges into itself, but that happens at the cusp, at a certain cusp in process where for an instant, the process has been arrested by that. So the being of the concrete in the way that we can attribute it in our static understandings of perception and in language is actually a stoppage of process for a beat, perhaps imperceptibly short beat, perhaps, but still genetically or ontogenetically a very important beat. And the concrete doesn't is that the moment that happens, whatever has created that emphasis for itself that stands out as a thing or as an object of perception is re-engulfed by the activity of the world and falls into the field of emergence from which it came and has to renegotiate its way back so that the enduring objects we perceive are actually achievements of a certain kind of self-activity within the general activity of the world.
I think that'll get us straight to the second one, movement precedes sense. And I think both of us have addressed the question of concrete is as concrete doesn't through movement. And the reason that I came to movement, I'm a dancer, so it was intuitive for me to come to movement. But the reason that I came to movement was because as I started to study touch in politics of touch, I realized that it was tempting to enter into the question of touch from the idea of the concrete, in the sense that I wanted, like so many others in that period, to talk about touch as a sense that had been backgrounded in relation to a certain kind of ocular centrism. And I wanted to talk about touch as a modality of knowledge in its own right. The problem was that then I read Concrete Is as Concrete Doesn't. I got confused. I started to wonder whether I was going down the wrong path. Was touch actually concrete? Did it make sense to think of it that way? And what I realized was that as a dancer, I couldn't reduce touch to the concrete. In a very, very pragmatic way, that's not how touch was working in dance. And so it took me a while to understand what I meant by movement precedes sense. And I think it really, truly took me 2 books to understand that. But what I came to understand is that the question of how we are in contact each other is a question of movement before it is a question of any simplified notion of a hand on a body or of a body in direct contact with a surface. That in fact, what we understand touch to be is movement. That the sense of touching and being touched is actually felt in what I ended up calling reaching toward. And so as that thinking developed itself through my thought, I started to realize that I needed the vocabulary of amodality, which, for example, I found in a citation like the one from Parables for the Virtual on page 1. The amodal is the point at which perception at the same time completes itself and shades back into an experiencing of the imperceptible. In other words, thought. In amodal completion, perception is caught in the act of feeding back into its conditions of emergence.
And maybe to gloss that, I'll go back to our third quote. Movement has the uncanny ability, in the words of experimental phenomenologist Albert Michot, to survive the removal of its object. So that is a strange statement. What it means is that there's a kind of experiential momentum where the body is taken up with the movement. And when the movement ends, the momentum carries the body forward past the ending point of the movement. So he was a phenomenologist who did a lot of studies of perception of causal relation and perception of movement. And he realized that when people were seeing movement, they were seeing the continuation of the movement. But a continuation of the movement hasn't happened yet. So what are they seeing? There's no sense impressions corresponding to the continuation or even to the past arc of the momentum, which is already past. So there's an already pastness and an already futureness, which are not present, but are constitutive parts of the experience. And the experience cannot have any sense in both the sense of direction and the sense of meaning without that. So something that is not there, but real, a real constituent, a real factor in experience, is abstract. And even though it's a continuation of vision, the basic feeling is kinesthetic and proprioceptive. So it's something that happens between the senses, but then the question is, in what sense is the between of the senses? And the answer is in no sense. It's amodal.
And so going back now to touch, the question was, how would this amodality do its work in the context of dance? And what I found helpful over time was a concept that actually comes from physics, but which I completely altered, which I call preacceleration. Preacceleration in the contact of 2 bodies, I extend it far beyond 2 bodies, but let's just say in the context of 2 dancing bodies, is what Brian was describing as the lived abstraction of their coming together, which is to say that in the dance, in the movement, say of 2 bodies improvising, we could talk about soccer, we could talk about social dance, we could talk about children on the playground. It doesn't have to be a formal encounter in any sense. Preacceleration refers to the welling activity of a relational fielding of movement that both bodies are responding to at once. So what I realized was that when two bodies move together, if we were to reduce it to the concrete sense of touch, we would be behind what the bodies were doing. That's too slow. So actually, bodies are moving in the pre-acceleration of movement together. Later on, in relationscapes, I came to think of a concept in adjacency to pre-acceleration, which I call pre-articulation, which is very much related to pre-acceleration, but at the level of the linguistics. So if I go back to that quote of Brian's where he's talking about the amodal, he says, in amodal completion, perception is caught in the act of feeding back into its conditions of emergence. This is also in linguistic terms very much at work, that thought is also amodally completed. And so we're talking about, when we're talking about the concrete and the abstract, I think we have to understand that any of these notions of sense that we work with that are limited to the self-presentation, the sense presentation, such as touch or vision, are always cutting through amodally, whether we're talking about a linguistic utterance or whether we're talking about a physical movement. And so that, I think, takes us then into, Brian has an interruption.
I wanted to interrupt and continue. The fourth quote, the motivation for taking the next step is relation. There has to be a force toward which to connect. So when in that other quote, when I said it's feeding back into its conditions of emergence, those conditions of emergence are relational. There has to be some kind of already in touchness or in each otherness of the operations of the senses before they separate out. And then each pulse of experience separates one out and presents often in a dominant mode. But that dominant mode can only set itself apart by taking up aspects of the other senses. So every perception is cross-modal or synesthetic and involves that self-abstraction of experience that you could think of as a thinking on a level with the feeling, on a level of the perception. So when Erin said movement precedes sense, it's setting the philosophy of the senses and the feeling on a different basis, because everything starts already in movement and movement is already in relation. Movement is activity, but if you talk about activity as the primary concept, then you can talk about different kinds of modes of activity. And if there were a unit or a pulse of that's somewhat separable from the ongoingness of experience, it would be an act, and the act would be an event. So you have a completely different set of concepts on which to base the philosophy that are not the subject. And then you have to rederive what we think of as the subject from that.
Yeah. Now where?
Wait, where were you going to go before?
I don't know. Now we have 4 pages. You know where I want to go? So this is when it gets nonlinear. How can I help it? So where I want to go with that is way forward to the concept of autistic perception, which you'll find, let's see, on the 4th page, I think. Yeah. So I want to take us to autistic perception, because I think that at least where my work has gone, has been to ask, what is the force that keeps us from understanding this way? Or what are the conditions of our worlds that hold us into a subject-object dichotomy or binary, that keep sense presentation and relations separate, that keep bodies separate from the world? And in my own work, I've talked a lot about these tendencies as neurotypical, where I've understood neurotypicality to be a systemic modality of organizing knowledge and bodies that is taught to us in the very earliest encounters with institutionalization. And an example I often give, just to put us in that field of relation, is one that's from Brian's son, Jesse, but I think it's an example that probably every parent can relate to, which is a moment where Jesse is a toddler and he falls on the ground and cries, and Brian runs up to Jesse and says, you know, what happened? Are you hurt? And Jesse, or where does it hurt? And Jesse points at the earth. So this moment where the child's body is not organizing itself as separate from the world. And this is a sort of crux moment, a key moment, because in that moment, if the parent says to the child, show me your knee, the child is learning the first lesson of neurotypicality, which is you are here and the world is there. Knowing Brian, I wasn't in Jesse's life then, I suspect Brian kissed the earth and didn't create this separation between body and earth. And this, I use this anecdote to take us into a concept that I've developed called autistic perception. And though the concept of autistic perception is a concept that takes us into the arena of accounts from autistics of their own modalities of perception, I don't understand autistic perception to be limited to autistics. I understand autistic perception is to be a limit condition that is lived in a much more foregrounded way by autistics than by others. And so on the fourth page, I have a quote that includes words from Mel Baggs that I'll read from the book Always More Than One. Autistic perception dances the environment, folding through a seeing feeling that does not delimit in advance the realm of experience. And here's the quote from Mel Baggs. My experiences have their own richness that other people may not be able to see, and they are far more than a mere lack of movement, conventional thought, speech, language, or perception. As someone whose cognitive and physical abilities vary widely from day to day and moment to moment, I know that this richness is just as present when I lack the capacity to differentiate one sensation or moment from another, as it is when I am engaging in complex thought. So I wanted to turn to that particular citation because what Mel Baggs is doing in that citation is taking us into neurotypical thought and putting a perception in and of the world, or situating a perception in and of the world as a problem for neurotypical thought. And what Mel is orienting us toward is that modality of experience that doesn't differentiate in advance between one sense modality and another sense modality. In the autistic lexicon, some people talk about it as chunking. And what they say is that in a neurotypicality, in a context of neurotypicality, the tendency is to chunk. Another word for that would be to categorize, which is to say to separate out. Whereas in autistic perception, the tendency is always in overlap, to be in the overlap of worlds of experience.
And so this concept of autistic perception, it can be easily misunderstood. Erin already said that it's not just something autistics have. What it is a way of talking about a stratum of experience that everyone has, that is also very close to what the experience of the newly born infant is, according to Daniel Stern and his research on infant perception. And it's actually a primary stratum where there's direct perceptions of moving complexity, of qualities of perception, calling forth to each other, creating complex patterns of contrast, constantly shifting, and to the extent that you can get lost in that. That's an experience that underlies a normative experience, neurotypical experience, without which we cannot function even as neurotypicals, because our ability to make connections between concepts that aren't prescripted, our ability to draw forth new connections through metaphor, all of those things depend on that sort of meeting place of the various dimensions of experience that Erin calls autistic perception, which is fundamentally synesthetic with a predominance of kinesthetic and proprioceptive experience leading the way rather than object-oriented vision. So that creates the question that starts going into some of the other levels of questioning that we write about, which is, given this relationship between chunking and autistic perception, between the standing out of static form that can be pinned down and its re-engulfing in process, that means that those two levels are constantly being articulated. And we're asked to accept a predominance, neurotypically, of the chunking, of the static form set definition side of things. And to background as much as possible the other. But if you renegotiate that relationship, then your activity is starting to recompose the senses. And that involves recomposing the body, because the body is nothing other than its capacities for sensing and feeling. So that becomes a political question of how you're going to do that and why you're going to do that. What kinds of practices, very pragmatic techniques are there for opening up that, reopening that articulation and renegotiating it. And that's a lot of what we've worked on together over the years through the Sense Lab and now in the 3E project.
Do you have a quote?
Yeah, I had a quote. Oh, where did it go? The infra-interval, page 4, top. The infra-interval is where perception itself is in absolute proximity with the body. And then the next one, perception infolds thoughts in the making. It does not reflect the world, it ingathers its relational fact into a feeling for its future. So what we're calling the infra level is this immanence of that field of complexity where the body is in direct contact with the vicissitudes of matter, generating, self-generating through activity not directed overall by the subject. The emergence of forms of abstraction that constitute forms of thought and can be built into more elaborate forms of thought. And at that level, there is a very complex interfusion, or what I sometimes call a confound or mutual inclusion of all of the dimensions of experience and different potential tendings, different tendencies that are, again, sort of abstract beings of abstraction, because tendencies are that arc from a beginning to an end that have a capacity to self-activate. So that infra level is super full. It's not more raw, because everything that happens feeds back in through the potential for it to happen again, or to be modulated, or to exclude other kinds of tendencies. And the body doesn't have that. The body is that. The body is the continual self-activity and receptivity, radical receptivity to relation that confound presents. So when Erin says that it ingathers relational fact into a feeling for its future, it means that in spite of all that complexity, which could be overwhelming, that there is a kind of pressure for that. Actually, pression is a word that Suzanne Langer uses for it. A pressure for that to distill down into a single output where something determinate takes shape and then alters the field, introduces or subtracts potentials, and then returns to the crowd. So that tending toward is one of the reasons why movement is primary in relation to sense, that there's a kind of futurity that's always drawing us forward as much as there are impingements that are pushing us from behind, and that the construction, the self-creation of our experience is, it sort of comes out of that pressure cooker.
I love this message coming in. There's no artsy blurring of us. It's just the sun.
Yeah, we're just enjoying the first real sun after a very hard 2 months of darkness with solar panels that weren't wanting to work for a long time.
Yeah, we're in an ecological house, no electricity, working with satellites. So this is what it looks like. Going back to what Brian was saying, I want to tell a story that is organized. You'll see the quote of it, those of you who can see the text on page 3, and it comes from Relationscapes. And it comes from a book that you might be familiar with by Oliver Sacks called Awakenings. And in Awakenings, which you may know from the movie Awakenings, and it's kind of relevant to our moment, because the book of Awakenings, or the book Awakenings, comes in the aftermath of the 1918 flu, which caused a kind of long flu, which resulted in hospitals being full of people who were in a kind of catatonic state called encephalitis lethargica. And so post 1918, there were whole wards of these patients who lived a kind of long sequel to that pandemic. And he found himself in the hospital and had an intuition that this wasn't actually a catatonia. He thought that the bodies, these people were not fully in a catatonic state. And you know, the image, if you've seen the film, that everybody will remember, is that he throws a ball at one of the patients and the patient catches it. So there was clearly in this context a way in which the patients were receptive to the world, but their receptivity to the world was not, it was not possible for them to break through into that receptivity unless their bodies were activated by an outside source of some kind. And they had already determined certain sources that could activate the bodies. Music was one of them, for example. At the time, levodopa was being marketed, which you'll know, or you may know, as the drug that people take when they have Parkinson's. And so levodopa was being marketed, and Oliver Sacks was aware in a way that he didn't articulate quite, but that became part of his work, that what we understood to be a not moving body, so a catatonic body, was not the opposite of a frenetic body, that in fact the non-moving body of the catatonia and the very activated body of the Parkinson's were on a spectrum together. And so in a move that would never be allowed today, he convinced the board to give these patients 1,000 times the current dose of levodopa to see what would happen. And so the patients received the levodopa and they woke up, hence the idea, the concept of awakening. And so I'm just going to read the citation, and then I'll say a bit more because it connects to what Brian was saying just now. So Hester was one of these patients, and you have to imagine that these patients awaken 40 years later, right? I mean, in 1920, when they fell into the state, there were no cars on the roads, you know, it's a different world. And so the awakenings are both momentous and horrifying. and they don't come without a great cost. So the bodies can be jolted into awakening, but this jolt is also one that has enormous side effects. And I write about this in the piece called Touch as Technique. But this is just a quote from Hester embedded in my words. So page 3, one of the aspects of her disease, Hester describes, is the experience of the smoothness of space during her, quote, catatonic states. Smoothness for Hester is akin to having, quote, no sense of process, of forces or field. These are her words. Standing in for the propelling force of activation is a flatness, an uninterrupted vista of nothingness, an infinitely slowed down movie experience that she can but watch passively, quote, like a movie film which is running too slow. Hester describes herself as inertially alive in her movie world, but incapable of relating to an, quote, elsewhere. The only option left to replay her movie in slow motion in an inward folding account of the same nowhere again and again to infinity. So these are all ways that Hester and Rose and other patients talked about the regression that would happen when the effects of levodopa began to fade. And so what would happen in the vocabulary that Brian and I have been using is that they would be in a tension between an all-encompassing autistic perception, so in an all-encompassing abstractness, where there isn't enough concreteness to catch them back in the act. So the levodopa was facilitating a certain hold on the world that could facilitate a differentiation between these qualities of expression that Hester here talks about as this kind of infernal nothingness into nothingness of the moviescape. Elsewhere, she talks about it as one of those mirrors where you see yourself over and over and over and over again. And what's interesting is that what these patients found is that they could develop techniques for bringing the abstraction and the concreteness into interplay. And one of the techniques was Rose. She would carry little pieces of paper in her pocket. And as she felt these regressions happen, as the world would regress and there was no purchase anymore, and her body would fall into this kind of catatonia, she would drop these papers on the ground, and in dropping these papers on the ground, her body could take another step. And so this is a way of perhaps giving us an image for this infra-sensing, concrete, abstract interplay that is necessary in the sense.
There's so much in that account. An inward folding account of the same nowhere again and again to infinity that you can only replay like a movie. That sounds like reflective consciousness. That sounds like the epitome of reflexive consciousness. And this is a weird situation where they're at the same time in autistic perception, but a reflective, inactivated state toward it. And then the papers that she threw on the ground broke the smoothness and created an interruption. I'll read another quote from page 1. There's always a something doing, cutting in, interrupting whatever continuities are in progress. For things to continue, they have to re-continue. They have to rejig around the interruption. So those little interruptions are forces of activation that rejig the body into that infra-interval where it's in touch with its own relational potential under a pressure from the future for a particular act or form then to be drawn out of it. So that's what was missing in these patients. And you could generalize from that by saying, well, she didn't just use her will to suddenly start doing what she wanted to do. Voluntary action was powerless. And in general, voluntary action is derivative, if not powerless. What she did was induce her own body she did a voluntary act that created a force of activation that put her body into motion. And there's this sort of paradoxical status of something that is involuntary and elicited at the same time, sort of an in-between of the voluntary and involuntary. And that's a really good model for how to address artistically or even politically this level, that you create little inductive interruptions that create forces of activation that brace the body into a situation already primed or oriented toward a certain tendency toward an outcome, so that there's no, the freedom isn't complete choice of which way to go, because when you have that complete choice, there's usually, you could infinitely ruminate why one or the other, and in the end it would be very hard to actually come up with a good reason for one or the other. But instead of deciding in that way, you create a situation where your body situation in the relation in the world decides and carries your life with it, and you recreate or reconstruct a portion of your life through that, so that you're indulging in practices of emergence in relation to yourself, but they're immediately relational, so they're at the same time trans-individual, or in direct contact with the potentials that are exemplified or offered by others. And there's a quote on trans-individuation, but I don't know if we have time to get that.
As we reach the time that is, as I said, we could do this for 5 months. So I wanted to make sure that we got to one other place of an example, because maybe that'll be part of the conversation. So those of you who never managed to see our printout, don't worry too much about it, because we only got to 4 quotes and there are 5 pages, and we can always send it to you. And it's really just a compilation of 20 years of thought. So, you know, it's not necessary for what we've been doing. But I wanted to take us back to what Brian was saying in the beginning about the senses always, about sensation always being synesthetic. So for some people, synesthesia is a new concept. Perhaps synesthesia simply has to do with an experience of sensation in overlapping modality. So tasting color, for example, or hearing color is another typical one. And I wanted to go to some more recent work of mine, with the particularly in collaboration with John Lee Clark, who's a deafblind poet. John Lee Clark has a really important concept that is very much connected to what we're talking about here, that he calls distantism. And distantism is a concept that he crafted to articulate the more political side of these questions, how we value experience. And it links in really totally for me to the way that I describe neurotypicality. And in John's work, what he's problematizing is the way that our distant senses give us an account of the truthfulness of the world. In the deafblind experience, the way that this is enacted is through the presence of what is called, believe it or not, the intervener, still called the intervener. So the intervener is the seeing, hearing person who makes sense of the world for the deafblind person. And it won't surprise you that even the most sensitive and caring interveners give the perception of the world through a modality that I would call neurotypical, which is to say that they organize what matters in the world according to the architectures and the geometries of neurotypical experience. And so in his work on distantism, what John does is he not only shows us our predisposition for situating the world at a distance as as carrying value. For example, it is quite common for deafblind folks to be led standing up through the middle of a space to get from A to B. This is terrible. It gives them absolutely no information. There's no wall, there's no doorway, there's no shift in the architecture for them to perceive. So all they have is the account by the intervener of how the world is existing around them, rather than allowing them to experience the world through touch by getting on their knees or putting their hands on the wall or doing whatever is necessary to receive and be in engagement with that space. So in my reading on distantism, as you can imagine, I found so much of this work. And in the midst of all of that, it occurred to me reading John's poems that he was synesthetic. Now, in the normative neuroscientific literature, a deafblind person couldn't be synesthetic, especially not in the modality of synesthesia that I was talking about, which is mirror vision synesthesia. And so I have a little citation on page 1 from one of John's writings where he says, I wasn't conscious of it. It was natural, so natural, in fact, that I didn't have a name for it. This skill that goes beyond just feeling texture, heft, shape, and temperature. And this, it continues, me pulling from his words. This is what he calls meta-tactile touch. He says, meta in its voluminous quality is the excess in touch that involves many senses, senses that we all have, but which are almost never questioned, the axial, locomotive, kinesthetic, vestibular, all tactile to some extent, but going beyond touch. So I wanted to make sure that we got back to this citation because it gets us all the way back to the question of reaching toward, which had me going down the rabbit hole of the amodal.
Mm-hmm. And maybe to finish off, I'll do one last quote that takes us back to the beginning and the thought of movement. Erin said that she was catapulted in philosophy of movement by being a dancer. I was catapulted into it by not being a dancer, by not being a mover in any sense. And I wanted to read this quote as a way of explaining where I found movement in spite of not actually moving as a practice. Each act, this is on page 2, each act carries the edge of all it wasn't. The force of what does not come to be reverberates across it. The feeling of what is excluded, a contour thick with potential of all that sideways tinged, the expression of what actually came to be. So the edge of all that wasn't, but could be. It's a statement of intensity of experience, of moving toward an immanence of experience in itself, where there's a feeling of potential that is not necessarily acted out, but has a certain sort of affirmative tenor and a joy to it. Deleuze talked about intensive voyages and travel in place, and said that he had that predilection, whereas Guattari was the one who would go out in the world and dance. And I think it's a pretty good combination.
So thank you for going through this journey with us, and hopefully we'll be able to have a conversation now with more of you.
That was really wonderfully rich. I want to direct you towards the Q&A if you can see it. And actually, if you click on where it says answered, I'll actually read this aloud if you don't mind, from Julia Yesbeck. She asks, or she says, I would love to hear a bit from Dr. Manning and Dr. Massumi about the presumed irony of our current form of engagement for a talk about the misplaced concreteness of the senses. What do they make of the hyper-mediation of our world today? Can they speak to the idea of presence as it is reconfigured in our highly mediated environments?
So we're just rereading it.
Should we go about a couple questions at a time and then allow you to sort of
Well, I
process?
think it's better one at a time so we can do them justice, don't you think?
Yeah, I think one at a time, because we're just learning to be back in this context of giving talks. We were talking before about how we've really been away from this environment. So do you want to talk about hypermediation? I think it's a really interesting question.
Yeah. Obviously, we are mediated through and through in the sense that so many of our connections and relations pass through social media, mass media, other forms of mediation. But from the process philosophy point of view, every act of mediation actually lands in an event, and this is a distributed event where it's landing at the same time in a number of laps. But nothing happens unless it, what Whitehead calls, makes ingression into a situation. So there are, rather, we think more in terms of routes of transmission of forces of activation and forces of priming or pre-formatting that make ingression eventfully into situations, addressing the intensive dimension of the body as much as the conscious reflective dimension of thought, so that it's actually immediation with transmitted factors. So both of us critique the concept of mediation, not in order to underestimate the importance of what others talk about as mediation, but to give it a slightly different philosophical cast that once again brings it back to events of the body and raises that very thorny and particular question of what constitutes a distributed event and what sense making happens through those distributed events, which, as we see in social media, is highly consensual overall, but at the same time capable of creating what people talk about as bubbles of agreement.
Yeah, and what I would add to that is it's such a vital question in the sense that we can't get around it. We can't think any of this without asking this question, I think. And it has a lot to do, I think, with the layer at which we enter into this problematic. And so when Brian and I are entering into the problematic at the layer of process philosophy in the really strong sense of the philosophical, we are always trying to think through immediation and what are the effects of immediation. But if I'm, for example, trying to think through how to teach in a university with students who are neurodiverse, then I'm coming at it from a different angle and very aware about the institutional strictures that are so neurotypical and how they're closing off the potential for everything we've talked about. And so a lot of our work, or maybe all of our work, has been about practice and creating the conditions for other ways of living. I don't think any of this can be done in the abstract, not understood in the way we've been talking about abstract, but in the abstract in the sense of not taking seriously the lived abstractions that are needed. In my most recent work, I've been also thinking this through in relation to questions of race, because it seems very, very important to recognize that there's a conversation to be had between whiteness and neurotypicality, or in another way of talking about it, between neurodiversity and Blackness. And so when we're thinking about the way that the hypermediation organizes bodies, we are also thinking about modalities of whiteness, which are very relevant, I think, to that question. And Brian's work on ontopower is directly speaking back to these kinds of questions. What was interesting about developing this 5-page document of our work was to see how many times or in how many ways Brian and I would go back from the process philosophical into ways in which the world would capture this thinking, and then back again into the process philosophical, whether it was through 9/11 in your work, Brian, or through Reagan, or through the university in my work, or through questions of race, or through questions of neurotypicality. So I guess the important thing for me is that we always take away that the work that we're trying to do is not prescriptive. It's really profoundly about experimentation.
Great, thank you. Our next question comes from Juan Cajigas, who says, hello, this discussion reminds me of Japanese philosopher Kitaro Nishida. His concept of basho, translated as place, reflects the active emptiness before the subject-object dualism. In Western ontology, we tend to move between subjectivisms, idealism, or objectivism, now object-oriented ontology. So any questions you would have to say, or any responses to that would be most welcome. Thank you.
It's a great question. Neither of us knows Nishida's work very well, but we are in ongoing conversations with a specialist on his work, Thomas Lamar. And I think that there are a lot of connections, because Nishida was highly influenced by William James, who is also a formative influence in our thinking and process philosophy, and had a notion of radical empiricism that, like Whitehead's thought, is in many ways convergent with certain aspects of Asian thought. So I think that's a really rich connection to explore.
And I think it's important, the observation that you make, that we move between subjectivism and objectivism, and I think that Brian and I have stayed away from saying too much about object-oriented ontology, because we find it really not that interesting to think about and talk about, not so much because it seems to us to recreate the same kind of dead end that subjective orientations did. And what we're interested is neither, as you point out. What's interesting to us is that emergent field of relation that is doing its work before it gets captured into those positions, which is not to say that once it's positioned in the world, it doesn't also have an effect, hence my comments earlier on about racism. Obviously, when a person is walking down the street that gets raced as a male Black man, we have suddenly an account of experience that is objectified and subjectified at once. The question, though, is our entering into the subjectified, objectified nexus going to take us the step we need to go in order to attend to how else to encounter that event? And I think Brian and I would both say that particular crux is not so rich. And so we would go in other directions. We would follow thinkers like Fred Moten and Stefano Harney in directions of sociality. We might go down roads that people like Saidiya Hartman take us, or Tina Camp take us. We would definitely go down roads that autistics like Tito Mukpadai take us, or other process philosophers take us. Yeah,
and that pendulum swing that constantly happens between subjectivism and objectivism, there are others like it that are equally frustrating. For example, between materialism and idealism, which is obviously very related to the first one, and everyone wants to deconstruct them. Everyone wants to get out of those dualities. It's been a refrain for decades in recent thought, but it's in order to do that, you sort of have to refigure each side and bring them together as pulses or stases of process, sort of in the way that water, ice, and vapor are phases of each other. And then you have to have a concept to hold that together and to be able to work with it in a very precise way. So I don't think you'll ever find discussions in our work, or very rarely, of those general level concepts, because they all carry such baggage of the dualities that have come through them, that we try to create a concept and then work it differently. And that sort of complicates our relationship to things like the new materialism, because our emphasis on amodality, thought being at a level with perception and feeling, scrambles the whole notion of materiality, even though it's probably much more in keeping with physics' notion of matter in the present day, on quantum and other levels where it doesn't have these sort of chunky, static, law-abiding properties that the old notion of matter had. So, yeah.
I'd like to follow up with a question from Penn Anthropology's own Greg Urban. And I know you've been working on Perce, or thinking through Perce and the idea of the continuum more recently, Brian. But Greg asks, Professor Urban asks, how do you understand semiotics in the sense of Perce in relation to the priority of movement over Cartesian reflection? And he follows up asking, semiotics in particular in terms of Perce's classification of signs and its use in understanding or becoming attuned to linguistic and cultural practices. So it sounds like, how do you mobilize Perce as part of this project that you're embarking?
Yeah, Perce is such an interesting case, so complex, so inspiring and maddening at the same time. So I keep coming back to it without ever trying to encompass his thought, which is impossible. He seemed to suffer his thought more than he controlled it. But I like to work with this concept of semiosis rather than the notion of the semiotic as it's entered into cultural theory, and because that's a process concept. Movement is completely fundamental to his thinking, because he's very concerned with chaotic and quasi-chaotic movements, and talks a lot about that. The sign in Perce, as I'm sure everyone knows, greatly overflows the bounds of language. So anything that registers and leaves a trace is a sign. That happens in physics as much as in philosophy, but it happens in different modes. So his endless proliferation of kinds of signs was, I think at some point someone counted over 700 of them. It was this attempt to do a repertory of all the different modes of import that can arise from the registering of signs. So anyway, that's not saying a whole lot about how I work with it, but the most important thing for me is to see his trichotomy, and especially the threeness of the firstness, secondness, and thirdness, not as separate functions, but as factors or aspects of every function, that they're always bearers of each other, that there is a firstness of thirdness, which is that concept of a mediation I was talking about in relation to forms of transmission that we usually talk about in terms of mediation. And firstness is something that's completely fascinated me, because it's attributing as primary a mode of existence that's so liminal that it's almost ungraspable, and it's a direct qualitative resonance in the world, and that can never actually be experienced alone, but only as enveloped in or calling forth other dimensions of secondness and thirdness. So anyway, there are a lot of aspects of his work. I tend toward the more philosophical rather than semiotic aspects when I sort of poach from him.
We have another question. Merleau-Ponty's notion of flesh seems to resonate with some of the ideas you've spoken about, such as amodality, topology, a tactile or a notion of the tactile beyond touch. Has this notion influenced your work?
Yeah, so some years ago, I answered this in writing in a text that you can find if you want to look for it. It's called Wondering the World Directly, How Movement Outruns the Subject. And it's in, what's that journal called? Body and Society. And I say that because whenever you're critical, as I'm about to be with Merleau-Ponty, if you're around a committed phenomenologist, you might just get your head cut off. So if you want to know a more nuanced way in which I answer that it's there, what I would say is that Brian and I are both people who've read Merleau-Ponty very carefully and who have appreciated his thinking and recognize him to be a really important thinker for so many of the thinkers that we think with. But Merleau-Ponty died arguably just at the moment where his thinking was going to change. I think that's true. He was teaching Whitehead. His last two seminars were on Whitehead. And if you read the final sections of his set of notebooks from The Visible and the Invisible, he's talking about how he may have gone down the wrong road by returning everything to reflective consciousness. So the reason that there's a separation in our work from the notion of flesh in Merleau-Ponty's work is not because we can't see the incipient potential of those concepts in his work, especially when he's talking about them through his examples with Cézanne, for instance, or Gestalt. But because he was still retaining a concept of the subject that was perspectively looking in. And this is a real difference from a Whiteheadian approach, which refuses any notion of a pre-existing subject. The world is in activity. If you go to Merleau-Ponty's last works, the two last courses on nature, and you fabulate a bit, because obviously we don't know this for sure, what you get, I think, is a sense that he's trying to understand specifically this concept that Brian and I began with, which is misplaced concreteness, because those two texts of Whitehead's that he's reading from and that he's teaching from are working with the concept of simple location and the problem of simple location, which is a key concept in Whitehead, which is the same concept as the misplaced concreteness, which has to do with our tendency to put nature somewhere. And so I think if I needed to pull out the concept in Merleau-Ponty, which was closest to what we were doing, I would say flesh. I think you're absolutely right that there are adjacencies. But today, I think I would go more towards Hortense Spiller's concept of flesh than toward Merleau-Ponty's concept of flesh. And the reason I would do that is that like I said, in Merleau-Ponty, you're still carrying a certain quality of the subject, which is to say, in my view, a certain whiteness, a certain neurotypicality. Whose perception are we talking about? Whereas what Spillers is doing in her extraordinary work on flesh, which is so central to all of the thinking that has come out over the last 20 years in Black studies, is recognizing that while slavery and colonialism and all of the institutions in the afterlife of slavery carry and kill and capture the body, they can't quite do the same to flesh. That flesh has an amodality, which is not to say it can't be incredibly damaged and seared. And beloved is always the image that I have when I'm thinking about Spiller's notion of flesh. But it is also a concept that can't be grasped, that can't fully be taken. And so I would say that a lot of our work, at least what I hope that can be taken away from this, is that we would always want to be reading someone like Merleau-Ponty with a kind of hypothetical sympathy for where the work could go. I, in my own piece, looked at how Merleau-Ponty was not great on movement. And I think that tells you a lot about a thinker, because to be able to think movement is to be able to think at that emergent relational infra level where subjects and objects are not yet. But I have had enough discussions with phenomenologists to know that many phenomenologists find this in phenomenology, and so this is a complicated rat's nest to answer into or to engage with.
Merleau-Ponty was actually my first great philosophical love, but I guess I left him to deviate through Deleuze and then onto Whitehead. So it's been a long time since I've done a serious rereading of his work, but I was really captivated by his attention to the qualities of the senses and the mechanism of the senses. Where I wouldn't follow him now is, although I think the concept of the flesh is really important, I wouldn't give it the kind of ontological priority he does. Partially because it takes it seems to overlay the non-organic world and the liveliness of the non-organic world with a kind of veneer of human readiness, that there's a kind of pre-reflexive structure in the world that is already lending itself to human thought and language. And for me, that, and then there's the return to the pre-reflective, and the experience of the flesh of the world is always thought about as a return, almost like a return home. And I think, from my point of view now, that underestimates alterity and radical alterity in the fact that according to Whitehead, the matter itself is feeling, that there are thought processes of a sort in matter. The body, he says, is shades into the environment. It's simply the most proximate part of the environment, and that there's no demarcating line or essential difference in nature between the movements of matters described in physics and the emotional movements of the living body. So he's opening the body to the world. And I've just been rereading Suzanne Langer's work, and one of her later massive works called Mind, Volume 1, goes into an incredibly minute analysis of the biochemical bases of human experience, and she finds basically all the concepts we've been talking about at that level, without an overlay of flesh, because that's the level that feeds into the flesh. So I guess there's a kind of anorganicism in I think both of our thinking, that for us is a way of welcoming the non-human and the more than human, even beyond the realm of flesh.
Right, and that question of the more than brings me to a final question that I'll hopefully sort of braid into an additional question from an anonymous attendee, which is the more than the surplus value of life, Jamesian notions of moreness, or Bucas migrants notions of moreness, one might say. How do these ideas of surplus, excess, figure within not only your own philosophies, but also your pedagogies? And also the question of neurodiversity itself. And this brings me into our final question, which is neurodiversity, and I quote our attendee, neurodiversity is such a new vocabulary that is so helpful and important, especially in its ability to be operational or operationalized for folks, myself included, the attendee, who fall on the neurodiverse spectrum in advocating for needs in the world. But it also seems insufficient sometimes as a philosophical or theoretical concept. And I wonder if it solidifies a binary of typical / diverse that presupposes a linearity we try to resist in theoretical work. And so our attendee asks, have you found other possibly more capacious vocabularies to think through some of this stuff? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that it's a complicated question, and it's an important question. And in the preface to my most recent book, For Pragmatics of the Useless, I address it actually straight on. There are a couple of vocabulary things that are particular to me that you'll find a bit differently in the wider discussions around neurodiversity. So, for example, I never use the word neurodivergent, which has become more and more used. And the reason I don't use neurodivergent is exactly because I don't like the binary. So I've written quite a bit about what I call diversity and diversity. And what I'm trying to do with diversity and diversity is not reduce all diversity to one thing, or to do something like say that we're all different. That's not what I'm trying to do. What I'm trying to do is to recognize neurotypicality as a systemic modality rather than as a person. Because if we don't understand neurotypicality as a systemic modality in the same way that we don't understand whiteness as a systemic modality, we never change the systemic operations. And those are where my attention has been situated for years. The other problem, which has always been really frustrating for me, is the neuro-reductionism around the concept of neurodiversity. And again, I've written about this in sort of a plea numerous times. It's a complicated question because on the one hand, I am constantly in collaboration with people who are actively and acutely affected by their neurodiversity, in the sense that they can't enter into education. And so my own classroom has been open for the last now probably 15 years at least, or 10 to 15 years, to folks who are excluded from education. And I've had 14, 15, 16-year-olds in my PhD classes, they've been online for years. And it is not at all atypical that we'll find young people who are autistic who are in PhD courses because that's the only place that they can be in, because their only other option is so-called special education, where they're basically just, in some kind of babysitting situation. And, a book that we published some years ago by Tito Mukhopadhyay called Plankton Dreams is a beautiful book about his own life of being stuck in those contexts. So I hear you absolutely about the problem of the vocabulary. And I think that it's probably fair to say that I've multiplied that vocabulary and multiplied it and multiplied it and multiplied it over years, and that Brian has multiplied it. And that depending where you read us, you read different multiplications of that vocabulary, and that there's a certain kind of strategic duplicity. I know when I need to use the vocabulary because we need to be talking straight about whiteness. We need to have this conversation. And the only way I'm going to be able to have that conversation is to enter into the vocabulary of neurotypicality, because I know that the vocabulary of privilege in relation to whiteness doesn't work well, but that there's something that can be heard when we bring it into the context of neurodiversity. And that can be really important in the context of a classroom, where I say to people, look, this frontality we experiment with in the classroom, it just doesn't work for neurodiversity. The seminar structure that we think is so great, where we sit around a table and look at each other, this is hell for neurodiverse folks. The idea of getting students to do a seminar, the way we typically organize our classes where everybody does a presentation, hell. The way we call on people, hell. So then, if we begin to articulate all of these troubles in the classroom, then we begin to get a sense for how complex it is for us to rethink our classroom in a way that meets the needs of neurodiversity. And then we find out that every neurodiverse person in the classroom also has a difference in relation to what needs need to be met, how, and so on. And so that we can't sort of generalize, and the classroom becomes a site of a kind of emergent dramaturgy of a complexity. And so, for example, in my classrooms, it's totally fine to walk in and out. We've always had an online aspect. You feel overwhelmed sensorially, just walk out, go with take your phone on a walk, go and listen to it elsewhere, go have a nap somewhere. But what I find is that often from the perspective of the institution, this looks like I'm allowing people to not do any work. And I'm constantly accused of that, you're allowing people to walk out of your classroom and therefore they're not learning, when in fact, the walking out itself becomes its own form of learning that we're also learning from. So it's not without its really complex, it's complex questions.
Yeah, and I think it's important to bring out one thing that Erin writes about a lot, which is that there's no such thing as a neurotypical person. Neurotypicality is systemic. It's a modality. It's a framing. It's a set of prescriptions. And to the extent that someone approaches coinciding bodily and mentally with that, they're getting closer and closer one step from death, because it's stasis. It's simply the maintenance of the norm. So everyone has some neurodiversity within them that is, like when we're talking about that info level of synesthesia and relationality and proprioception, that is the seat of neurodiversity. But most people make accommodations or allow themselves to be subsumed by modalities of what Guattari called normopathy, normativity, and invest themselves in it. And they invest that in the institution, and the institution invests in that aspect of them. So it becomes a constant struggle in relation to any kind of institutionalized milieu in society. The choice of vocabulary, I don't know that it would help in the end to find one overall term, because as Erin said, there's a lot of strategic reasons to use one rather than another, depending on the context, because they bring with them different contexts. They address different sets of people, suggest different distinctions and concepts. So neurodiversity is really important to advance, because it has not until recently been attended to. But another word for neurotypicality that Erin talks about a lot in her recent work is whiteness. That carries a very different set of orientations and signpostings with it that open a territory that overlaps with, but is not the same as the territory of neurodiversity. Man with a capital N, like in the work of Sylvia Winter, is another that has another set of connotations. So we both tend to work with these multiplication of concepts that overlap but do something better at the same time, a bit offset in relation to one another, which is why we call our work so many different things: speculative pragmatism, radical empiricism, process philosophy, et cetera, et cetera. In terms of practice, the Sense Lab went through an intense period of about 5 years of experimenting with different ways of working with and through neurodiversity, which it was really intense and really interesting. We learned a tremendous amount from, and I think one of the key techniques or end concepts that came out of that was the concept of the threshold, also developed in Erin's work a lot, which is rather than talking to mediate the relation of neurodiversity and neurotypicality, you can think of the event of passing a threshold and what people carry through the threshold in terms of constraints and enablements. And then you can talk about different practices for thresholding differently. And that could be as literal as walking. What happens when you walk through the door into a group experimentation or to a class? And then once you pass, how can you expand the range of what people are fostered or enabled to access in their own modalities in the room in a way that welcomes as much of the diversity as possible. So we went through several years where there was a daily practice in the Sense Lab space of people of recomposing the space itself and seeing what difference it made, recomposing the spatial layout, the different perceptual qualities, the light, everything. And that went on for 3 years, basically daily recreating our spaces of interaction and trying to extract certain techniques from them. And so there are a number of different techniques and a number of, I think, very successful, but also a number of dead ends and sort of incredible crises, which happened inevitably when you move on to that territory and you open up all of that complexity, all of that hurt, all of that potential in a way that isn't pre-framed. So it's risky.
Well, thank you so much for spending the hour and a half with us this afternoon. It's really been an absolute pleasure, and thank you from the Department of Anthropology and the University of Pennsylvania for talking about your work and sharing some of the, especially after the sort of strange year and some change that we've been going through together. Lauren, do you have any closing reflections or thoughts you'd like to share?
Look, I found this incredibly productive and I really, really enjoyed it. And I think everyone else who was commenting in the chat and in the Q&A did as well. And so there's so many things to follow up on, but I am conscious of everyone's time. So again, thanks to you for holding this discussion and for everyone else for attending.
Well, it's a pleasure, and if anybody didn't get the text and they want it, feel free to email me or them. Part of the reason we wanted it accessible is we wanted to facilitate this for different modes of attention, and I'm aware of how much this mode of Zoom is demanding for so many people, this kind of frontality and the auditory talk modes. So anyway, it's available. Then thank you so much for both of you to have made us feel so welcome and to have allowed us to experiment instead of giving an already composed paper.
Okay. Thank you very much.
It's our pleasure. Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. Okay. Take care.
Bye-bye.